Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third panel of the day, Aligning Power, Leading by Design. My name is Emma Salisbury. I'm a fellow at the Council on Geostrategy, and I have been a parliamentary staff for 15 years, so the policy-making aspect is something very close to my heart. Our discussion here will be focused on a key question: how navies convene, lead, and shape policy implementation, bilaterally or in wider coalitions. We'll be exploring how a navy can act as a centre of gravity for national policy to align other countries in support of its own interests. Given how many of you here are at the nexus of policy and naval operations, you'll understand firsthand how vital this is. We'll be looking at some specific recent examples of alignment from the UK and our allies and partners, including Japan's maritime vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, as well as the countries that the United Kingdom and the Royal Navy should be looking to forge deeper connections with as we move further into the maritime 21st century. So to discuss these issues, we have an absolutely wonderful lineup. Firstly, the Second Sea Lord, Vice Admiral Martin Connell, who has responsibility for the delivery of the Royal Navy's future capabilities, strategy, and long-term programme. Second up, we have Stephen Lillie, who is the Director for Defence and International Security at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And then Major General Jim Morris, Commander of the Standing Joint Force, which is a rapidly deployable component that provides operational command and control to the Joint Expeditionary Force. And last but certainly not least, Ian Bowers, Associate Professor at the Institute for Military Operations, Centre for Joint Operations at the Royal Danish Defence College. Vice Admiral Connell, can we start with you?
Thanks very much. There we go, I'm on. Thanks, Emma. Good afternoon, everybody. I realise this is the graveyard slot, so we will try and mix this up a bit and hopefully make it stimulating for questions. But there's a bit of a trap in the question. How do navies lead policy? I don't want to be on record saying, here's how we lead policy. I like to think we help shape it and inform it. And let me just give you some examples, and happy to go into more detail and other areas in questions. Navies routinely operate together. I think that's something that when I speak to my Army colleagues, it's something we have to constantly remind some of them of. That it is normal for navies when they're in the same geographic regional area to do a passing exercise, a PASSEX. In fact, we look for those opportunities. We exploit them so that we can routinely manage to be able to do that rapidly if we need to in a crisis. So sometimes there's deliberate planning. Hey, we're going to be operating this area at this time. Would you like to work with us? Or there is, by nature of a crisis that comes along, how do we cooperate together? Let me give you a few examples of how, in the last few years at least, we've managed to do this. It was in 2020, if we'd have been sat here, we'd be talking about the dawn of a new carrier strike era. And I don't think we should underestimate that after a decade of having a capability gap, and that's what it was, a capability gap, that we've managed to recreate what I think is a credible global fifth generation carrier strike capability. But we did not and could not do that on our own. We very carefully thought just over 10 years ago, how do we work closely with our closest and most trusted allies to genuinely recreate a capability that's going to be credible, that's going to be global, that's going to be effective, that does give, in our case, the UK government, a national instrument of power that it can use at a time and place of its choosing. It was challenging, but what we managed to do was we worked with the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps in particular, but also the French Navy and some of our other NATO allies, notably the Netherlands Navy, so that from the outset, we would declare an initial operating capability that by design had a high benchmark of interchangeability. And that ambition was, and I know from the discussions myself and some in this room had, there was some concern about that. Are we going to be exposed? Can we really do this? Well, we can do it because we're working alongside some trusted allies. And the fact that we took that to the other side of the world during a global pandemic, sustained it there, and operated across government in terms of the sort of effects that we were seeking to achieve, I think is testament to how navies can convene. And Stephen may wish to comment on some of the cross-Whitehall activity that was in support of that. And we also, in just one deployment, managed to work with some 40 or so navies and air forces. So navies convene, yes, but they also convene with other navies, with other air forces, with Marine Corps, with allies, and with industry in terms of how we can exploit capabilities and develop capabilities. Another example, and it's come up in a couple of panel discussions, is AUKUS. I think a real strategic moment earlier this year, and that's multi-decade. It is strategic. We're looking at how we might be able to operate together, and specifically under Pillar 1, obviously, we're talking United States, the UK, and Australia. But under Pillar 2, yes, those three nations, but I do think in time there will be opportunities for expanding those capabilities, as was mentioned earlier, and including other nations. But Pillar 1, multi-decade, including industry, and of course we're in the foothills of that now, and it's going to be, I think, quite profound how our nations are going to work together. But it's built on a bedrock of 60 years of UK and US nuclear cooperation. And the fact that we are building today the Columbia and Dreadnought submarines together in the United Kingdom, United States, is profound. These are our nation's strategic deterrent, and it shows it can be done. And I think Australia took great comfort from that as well. And then finally, at a lower end of the spectrum, perhaps, but I think no less important, and it was subject of discussion earlier on, we also had discussions in the Navy about the benefits or risks of deploying offshore patrol vessels to the other side of the world. Because there's one camp which would say these are offshore patrol vessels, they've been procured and built to operate around the UK. That's what our support contracts say. We've got them single crewed. How on earth can we do this differently? But we also looked at the opportunity, working closer with some of our partners. So they've been deployed, those ships, and I'm talking in the Pacific specifically, but the others as well, for over 500 days, sustained. We've multi-crewed those ships, and as practitioners of navies know, that's not something you do lightly. That's been successful. It's given our people more certainty. It's enabled us to reconnect with nations and navies that we'd lost touch with. And that's gone down really well. And oh, by the way, we were in position so that we could respond to humanitarian crises. That's what governments want, right? What are our choices? What are our options? Well, we're providing more choices and working with partners in that part of the world. And I think there's more to come in that regard. I'll pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Martin. Stephen.
Well, firstly, Lord, ladies and gentlemen, great privilege to be here and to offer some thoughts from the diplomatic perspective. And as the director in the Foreign Office, leading on all things Pole Mill, I've got to say that the Royal Navy is clearly one of our most valued and most important partners. I would emphasise less the leadership thing. I don't think we need to compete for leadership. I would emphasise the partnership point. Seems to me that the Royal Navy, the diplomatic service, we are in a common enterprise of protecting the UK's security, promoting our prosperity, building our international influence. And that's not just a sort of a slogan that we've come up with. You will have seen, I think, this morning, you will have sensed the real enthusiasm from Minister Trevelyan for join up between the diplomatic service and the Navy. As a former head of mission overseas, I've seen in very kind of practical terms how well we work together and how well the Navy pursues not just its own defence-focused interests, but it's actually supporting the wider international agenda. And as a former ambassador to the Philippines, I think of HMS Illustrious deploying after Typhoon Haiyan to deliver humanitarian support. More recently, as High Commissioner to Cyprus, I think of the multiple visits that we had by HMS Duncan, by HMS Albion and the Littoral Response Group experimentation, and then of course most obviously Carrier Strike Group 21. And in all those cases, the Navy was coming in to do really high quality defence engagement, but you were also kind of spreading, raising UK influence and awareness of the UK in Cyprus in a way that actually very few other people are able to do. I think the expression steel and statecraft was used this morning. I mean, to me, it's a great example of the soft power of naval hard power. Now, of course, all of this has been a number of references over the course of the day to the integrated review. And I think this is fully consistent with the approach of the integrated review, IR21, the original one, now IR23. But the idea of bringing together all the levers of state influence, bringing together, as the Chinese would say, our comprehensive state power in order to pursue our objectives together. And the previous panel was talking about deterrence, which is very much pillar 2 of the new IR, deter, defend and compete. Very much, I think, a naval lead, not least in terms of the continuous at-sea deterrent. But actually, as a diplomat, what's on of the IR, so shape the international environment, and that is where including with other partners in Whitehall, including with the security and intelligence agencies, but to shape the international environment in a great number of ways that have been highlighted over the course of today. Again, reassurance through persistent presence. So I also am going to express my admiration for HMS Spey and HMS Tamar and their persistent presence in the Indo-Pacific. It sends a very clear signal of our commitment. It shows that the Indo-Pacific tilt is actually a bit more than a tilt. It's a permanent reorientation in UK international policy. It's about, crucially, it's about protecting the economy, about keeping the sea lanes open, ensuring that the choke points remain open. It's about demonstrating support for international law, for freedom of navigation, for the principles of UNCLOS. But also, I think, in this joint enterprise of shaping the international environment, what is really, really important is about building relationships, friendship, trust between the UK and a wide range of partners. And when we send ships to different countries, that is probably the most potent symbol of friendship and engagement that we can show. And so CSG 21 did that really well in the Foreign Office. We're very much looking forward to CSG 25, which is again going to be a huge opportunity to demonstrate UK commitment and engagement. Now, we were asked to say something about who we should work with, and I think it's clear. It's actually set out in the IR23 very clearly. The #1 priority is, of course, the Euro-Atlantic. But even there are choices to be made. There are new areas that we need to focus on. We need to think about the High North. We need to think about the Black Sea. Quite interesting discussion with some colleagues from the Navy recently, where we were talking about the Black Sea and is there a Black Sea strategy? And it's not clear that there is a Black Sea strategy. And if there is a Black Sea strategy, it's very much about the the countries themselves as opposed to the sea that they're around. So that's something that we need to think about. The Indo-Pacific, on which many people have spoken eloquently today, but this is really important. It's about showing our commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. It's about working with our closest partners to build capabilities in order for those countries to be able to maintain their self-defense, their deterrence, and that's AUKUS, of course, with Australia. It's GCAP with Japan. But we shouldn't also forget other neighbouring regions. And I would here particularly emphasise something that's very close to the heart of our Foreign Secretary and his commitment, his strong belief that we need to be building our relations with what he calls the global middle ground. Countries sometimes referred to as the global south, sometimes referred to as middle powers, sometimes as non-aligned. Countries which often, to borrow from the integrated review, may not always share our values, may not share all of our perspective, but they do share our commitment to the principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity, respect for international law, respect for the UN Charter. And there is more that we can do with those countries, not necessarily with the landlocked ones, but there's a long list of countries that are on the Foreign Secretary's list. So I think I'm just going to finish. I just wanted to say one other thing. As the Navy, I'm sure you have all sorts of kind of tentacles into different parts of the Foreign Office, particularly into the geographical parts and into the ministerial team and the board. But I would just say that my director at the Directorate for Defence and International Security, we are sort of there to help defence in the round and to help the Royal Navy. And, you know, when you can't get what you want from the geographicals, come and see us. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Stephen. Jim, you're up next.
Thank you. Admirals, distinguished guests, a very good afternoon to you. It's a great privilege to come here to be able to just chat something about the Joint Expeditionary Force and also to try to answer the question about how navies convene, lead and shape policy, although I'll pick from the Second Sea Lord start and talk specifically about operational policy implementation going forward. And certainly as I look around the room, I can see lots of people from different walks of life who at some stage have been touched by the development of the JEF over the course of the last few years. So it's great to see everybody here. I think in the course of my next 5 minutes, I want to briefly touch on three things. The first really is to do a very quick sort of JEF 101 so that everybody understands what it is that I'm talking about, because quite often in these kinds of conversations, there are some fundamental principles that are quite useful to set out before the questions then follow. Then I thought I'd just think about the JEF and its situation below the threshold of conflict and what that means for maritime power and the relevance of maritime power in that space. And then thirdly, I'll very quickly provide some examples of where the navies have led, convened and been part and parcel of operational policy implementation. So turning to my first sort of set of remarks, I think it's worth saying that the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, was born under the NATO framework concept at the Cardiff NATO summit in 2014. So it is in and of itself a NATO construct. It follows NATO doctrine, it follows NATO standard operating procedures. And there's often a question about how complementary, how conflicting is JEF with NATO. I hope that that starter sets the scene for how close and how complementary we think that the JEF is. Obviously 10 nations, 5 Scandinavian nations, 3 Baltic states, the UK and the Netherlands. And I've already made the point about it being complementary to NATO. Everything that we do, and certainly particularly over the course of the last year, everything that we plan to do in the future is ever more closely synchronized with the way that NATO is thinking about the future and their ongoing DDA planning. One thing that does distinguish the JEF from the NATO is its non-consensus nature. So it doesn't mean we're anti-consensus. It just means that where nations 1 + 2 + 3 all agree to do something, we can do it under a JEF banner without everybody having to agree. And the real strength of that is it gives the JEF some agility and some flexibility to move quickly and act quickly. And I hope to be able to give you an example of that later on. More recently, the GEF has been focused regionally in the kind of the geography that befits its membership, and also, as I've already alluded to, below the threshold of conflict. So we're not talking at the moment about the GEF being a warfighting organisation that somehow provides that kind of concurrency challenge with NATO, that conflict of interest with NATO, and very much looking to deconflict that. I think it's fair to say that over the last sort of 7 years since its inception, or certainly the 7 years from 2014 to 2021, it was very much a military interoperability and training framework. And lots of great work was done, and I was involved in my last job as part of that force development work. I think it's certainly clear and fair to say that since February of last year and the Ukraine invasion, the GEF has simply taken off. And once I got my instructions from my boss to go and operationalize the network in January 22, as we could start to see the signs of what was coming, certainly over the course of the last year, it really has picked up speed as a convening framework, both militarily and I think politically too. And we've certainly looked at sort of pull together national defence activity very quickly after we were sort of energised last February to start to demonstrate that kind of regional collective cohesion that was required at the time. I think there's also been an increase in political significance in the convening nature of the GEF. When I look back over 2022, as we headed into that year, I think we probably were looking at having a couple of two-star meetings. I think there was one defence ministerial and one CHODS meeting. As that year continued, as last year continued, I think in the end we had 5 defence ministerial meetings, 3 prime ministerial meetings, and a whole range of national security advisor and other forums, which just gives a sense of the convening power that is now being attributed to the GEF as we go forward. And certainly as I look forward to the year ahead and the work that we're engaged with now, following ministerial direction really towards the end of last year, we're looking at demonstrating or developing better the operating framework for the GEF. So rather than just coordinating near-term activity regionally, starting to think about how we would react to changing geopolitical circumstances, but below the threshold of conflict going forward. And central to that is the relationship with NATO. And certainly over the course of the last year, I think my guys and girls have invested very heavily with NATO. I've got a team out with Joint Forces Command Norfolk as we speak, helping them develop their planning. So great progress, I would say, but not perfect by any stretch. Plenty more to do and plenty more things to be developed and ironed out. But I do think, moving on to my second point, that the GEF's positioning below the threshold of conflict is really important. And I think it plays to many of the Navy's great strengths. I mean, to me, operating in that hybrid space below the sub-threshold is all about influence. Operating to communicate, or to use the current Defence Secretary's phraseology, demonstrating capability, solidarity and resolve. I think there's a great quote actually in the current edition of Maritime Doctrine. I think I'm okay to have read that. Professor Colin Gray, who says the greatest value of the Navy will be found in events that fail to occur because of its influence. And that makes the point about the centrality of influence and actually the utility of maritime forces in that space, which gives them the opportunity to lead, convene and help with policy implementation. So again, you know, a brief sort of look through the doctrine books and you'll come across the attributes of maritime forces: access, poise, mobility, persistence, versatility. I don't think in this august environment I need to go through those. But what it does give you is that sense of flexibility that the maritime can be in a position to lead using all of those attributes to ebb, to flow, to poise, to demonstrate, to calibrate the level of attention that is required in a particular situation. I think that really does work very well. So those capabilities, those attributes, I would suggest, offers a Navy the capability to lead, convene and develop policy. Whereas in the particular context of the GEF, I think the geography of the GEF's operating region and the inherent flexibility of maritime forces actually gives a Navy the opportunity to lead. So there's capability and there's opportunity, and I think it has come together very well in the GEF. I mean, so turning to my third point now and just trying to flesh out some examples just to back up that thesis. I mean, Baltic Protector 2019 was the first GEF operation. I think 3,000 people, 20 ships from across GEF. I think James Parkin, you led that at the time, but there was a perfect example of the Navy to the fore, pulling together the leadership in the maritime domain of a regional coalition. I thought that worked very powerfully. More recently, since Ukraine, little things. It sometimes only takes a ship or a bit of a determination and positioning. HMS Richmond, very quick to bear after the invasion of Ukraine, deployed to the Baltic Sea and very quickly to help support some supply deliveries to Estonia and to demonstrate that capability, but very quickly binding with the Latvians, the Swedes, the Lithuanians and the Danes, literally, 4 weeks after the invasion. I don't think that there was other sort of demonstrable military activity that was able to react quite so quickly. Turning to this year, HMS Mersey, again, arranged in under a month into the Baltic Sea contributions from 5 other nations. And that sense of putting, it doesn't necessarily have to be a Royal Naval vessel. I'm obviously using Royal Naval examples because the UK is a framework nation. But that putting of a maritime vessel, of a ship, into a place and advertising that we want to work regionally and with our partners acts as a sort of garnering force, if you like, and enables navies to lead in that space. When a single asset is not enough, we've already talked about Baltic Protector, but Jeff Lightning last year, the CSG out in the Norwegian Sea, the Baltic Sea, with Jeff Nations demonstrating that capability, and Joint Warrior earlier this year, where we had some amphibious assets, again, part of all of that, with further planning, looking forward to further CSG deployments later this year. So I hope in that small pitch, I've given you a sense of how far the Jeff has come, and particularly how far it's come with more journey yet to travel, but how far it's come in the last year, giving you a sense about why I think it's been a huge opportunity played well by navies to demonstrate the ability of navies to lead, convene, and to develop that operational policy, and to flesh out some examples of either that empowering ability of a ship to garner the contributions of others, or indeed the ability to deploy a capability and bring others to that too. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ian, you're up next.
Great, thank you. Admirals, General, distinguished guests, it's a great pleasure for me to be here in this room. It's an absolute honor. I have the kind of terrible job of kind of ending this day and trying to say something interesting after all the things we've heard. But when considering what to say today, I initially struggled to grasp what in about 5 minutes an academic like me can bring to this panel. But on reflection, I think this panel, and actually this entire day, is essentially about creating effects through the naval instrument of power. And understanding how to create such effects is where I think empirically driven and sometimes theoretically informed world of academia can cross the policy bridge and contribute to and inform actual policy and strategic outputs, if not inform, shape them a little bit too. Importantly, I think that in the discussions around naval operations and their contribution to policy, particularly in the civilian world, there is a tendency to focus on the operations or deployments themselves instead of a closer analysis of what effects are actually being created. And in a world where the survival of the international order is currently threatened, I think this is a really vital area to address. With this in mind, I've developed 3 questions that naval, strategic, and ultimately political planners should consider when seeking to use naval power, both as a center of gravity for national policy and as a pivot point around which other nations can work. So the first question is, do we, or does the Royal Navy, have sufficient credibility in terms of naval power in order to act as such a pivot? We've talked a lot about credibility today. So credibility requires not only capabilities in terms of platforms and equally importantly personnel, but also the ability to sustain a consistent presence in the targeted area of operations. Now, we've all heard achieving this is an extremely difficult and complex endeavor. Internally, navies must convince the governments of the day and the governments of the next day that what they do is valuable, that forced investment is a long-term and worthy exercise, and that they actually can deliver the effects that so many naval strategists and thinkers claim are fundamental outputs of sea power. In essence, naval leaders must consistently demonstrate capability in order for any government to have faith in the ability of their navy to act in the lead of policy and thereby overcome this affliction of sea blindness that periodically seems to impact the political and military strategic discourses. At the same time, externally, in order to bring other states with you as with deterrence discussed so interestingly in the previous panel, credibility is everything. Other states, particularly in theaters characterized by sustained and substantial levels of geostrategic competition, will not be fundamentally convinced by those relying on piecemeal deployments or resting on the promise of future deployments. Hence, what we may perceive as an important contribution and may be received on the surface as an important contribution may not be seen in the same way by the states you are trying to bring along in reality. In a theater such as East Asia or the Indo-Pacific, where there are numerous actors of considerable power consistently operating, power and presence matters if a navy is to create sustainable and substantial political and strategic effect. The second question that must be asked is, are the vital linkages between the other instruments of power and the naval instrument of power in place if navies are to act as such a convening element? Navies, I think we can all agree, are excellent as the tip of the spear, particularly in situations where power projection from distance matters. However, national military power is increasingly and inextricably linked to the use of other instruments of power. Again, we can see this much clearly in the Asia Pacific, where local powers are managing an intense period of great power geostrategic competition, and in doing so are looking for much, much more than just a naval contribution to relationship management. In inherently maritime systems, naval power is, of course, the natural pivot around which national policy can revolve. But to create true effect, naval power must be synchronized with economic, political, and security actions that can offset the inherent geographic strengths and economic leverage of the adversary. If we do not have this set up, what we will end up with is an increasingly isolated, unstable, and escalatory deterrent dynamic, and we don't want to be in that position. The final question underpins the other two, and that is, do our current and potentially future bilateral and coalition partners perceive sea power, and do they appreciate its value in the same way that we do? And this is essentially about what has been talked about so well today, about building and maintaining a comprehensive understanding of the operating environment and grasping that there is a variance in global understandings of sea power and the role of navies in national and international security. In Europe, and particularly in Northern Europe, the UK's and the Royal Navy's closest military partners have long understood the contribution that the Royal Navy and the British military can bring to their security and the collective security of the region. This comes from a long-term engagement through NATO and other forums to build this understanding. When seeking new partners, this is much, much more challenging. In the Indo-Pacific, states like Japan and Australia are natural partners who likely grasp the importance and relevance in sea power to their national survival, form the national security strategies around it, and seek to work with other partners who share similar views. But other states in the region will have very different understandings dependent on their strategic and operational situation. Hence, planners need to be extremely careful to appreciate the differentiated impact that naval forces and sea powers will have across what is a large and diverse region. And hence, choosing and working with new partners cannot be and never be a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather an extremely calibrated set of military actions. So putting these three questions together, I would say that, of course, navies can and often do play a vital convening role in national policy. But in order to do so in what is an increasingly competitive world, a clear understanding and measuring of intended effects, rather than the celebration or dismissal of diplomatic and political framing, is more important than ever. And with that, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's interesting to see all of the panelists today really focusing on the issues of partnership. And that's something that I think is so vitally important to all of us here.